So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nadia Yacoub. I'm a professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And I want to thank our sponsors, which are the Departments of Asian and Middle East Studies and History and the Institute for the Study of the Americas and Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies. And I especially want to thank the centers for all their help with the logistics. There's a lot of work that goes into setting up these talks. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my longtime friend, Avi Chomsky. And I mean, this talk is really long overdue because I've been here for 24 years and Avi has been coming regularly to North Carolina. And somehow I think the only thing we've actually done is I think Lou had her Zoom in for a talk. And it's criminal that she hasn't given a talk before at UNC. But the main reason for that is that she always chose to come for various reasons in the middle of summer when most of the rest of us aren't here. But I'm very happy to have her here now. So Avi Chomsky is Professor of History and Coordinator of Latin American Studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. Her books include Is Science Enough? 40 Critical Questions About Climate Justice, Central America's Forgotten History, Revolution, Violence, and the Roots of Migration, Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal, A History of the Cuban Revolution, They Take Our Jobs, and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, West Indian Workers and United Fruit Company in Costa Rica. She has also co-edited several anthologies, including Organizing for Power, Building a 20th Century Labor Movement in Boston, The People Behind Colombian Coal, Mining, Multinationals, and Human Rights, which also has a title in Spanish, which I will not butcher, The Cuba Reader, History, Culture, and Politics, and Identity and Struggle at the Margins of the Nation State, the Laboring Peoples of Central America and the Hispanic Caribbean. And she's also been active in Palestine and Latin American solidarity and immigrants' rights movements for several decades. And her talk tonight is on settler colonialism from Latin America to Palestine. So please help me in welcoming.
And so my title comes from the recent book by Adam Kirsch, which some of you may have come across or heard of. And I heard about the book, I think the day it was published, because the Boston Globe did a huge piece on it. And then I saw it was being covered everywhere. Radical ideology at the heart of anti-Israel protests. How many people have actually heard of Adam Kirsch's book? He just got everywhere all of a sudden when this book came out. He had a big article, cover piece in The Atlantic. It was covered in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Israeli press. And it was clear to me when I read the first review of it that this was a really dangerous and noxious analysis. And I needed to read the book itself. But the main argument that he makes in his book is that he calls settler colonialism a radical ideology, which surprised me because I thought settler colonialism was an academic concept, not an ideology. But he says it's an ideology because it's a set of beliefs about how the world works. And I feel like he's lifting a lot from the anti-critical race theory arguments that is focusing in on an academic idea and saying, this is really divisive and hateful and is going to lead to genocide if people learn about this idea. And he's doing the same thing for settler colonialism. And the way he frames it is that, so in ordinary colonialism or franchise colonialism, as it's called in the literature, we have in the last 500 years, primarily European powers going out, colonizing other distant places by sending a few bureaucrats to rule over and develop an extractive economy and force native people to work for them. And then eventually, you know, this is like from the 1500s through the early 1900s. Eventually, in the mid 20th century, we start having decolonization, where all of these colonies kick out the European power and become sovereign nations. So the model that people have in mind when they talk about this is often including Latin America, although Latin America, of course, was colonized much earlier and became independent much earlier. But again, the Spanish were kicked out, the Portuguese were kicked out, we have these new sovereign nations. But primarily the model is South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, where you have the more recent European colonizations, and then this period of decolonization after World War II. Settler colonialism, the way the concept has developed, describes places where the Europeans came not to rule over the native population, but to stay and to eliminate and pretend that there is no native population, and to erase both culturally and physically the native population that lives there. And this happened primarily in what's called the Anglosphere, the British North America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and Israel is the one that he's really writing about. But his argument is that the concept to try to identify this settler colonialism is dangerous, because it means that for decolonization to happen, the colonizers must be eliminated. Therefore, if we use the concept, it's going to lead to genocide against Israeli Jews. Everybody follow the logic of his argument? Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the narrative. This is kind of what I was talking about in the previous slide, of how historians have understood the concept of settler colonialism, seeing it's really connected to the creation of nation states, which started in Europe. Europeans create nation states, and that the very process, in critical analysis of nation state formation, looking at things like Eric Hobsbawm and Benedict Anderson, that the creation of the European nation state is also a historical process of imposing homogeneity by expulsion, coercion, and assimilation of populations. And you can again look at Spain in the 1300s and 1400s, where the nation state of Spain is carried out through this process of to create a Catholic nation state, to impose the Castilian language, Catholic, by the expulsion of Muslims and Jews, the imposition of the Castilian language as the one language. And this happens not only in Spain, but in France and Italy, where local languages are eliminated to create this homogeneity. So this idea of expulsion, coercion, and assimilation, and I say replace ethnicity, that is multicultural entities where people live in multicultural spaces, with this idea of the nation state, that everybody is supposed to have some kind of ethnic connection within the borders that are drawn of these countries. I'm also thinking of, say, peasants into Frenchmen. Like, how do you turn these multicultural peoples into a single nation state? That too is a process of invention and violence. But this is really where European colonialism starts, with the creation of European nation states, and then is expanded beyond Europe's borders. Franchise colonialism, as I was just describing, the idea of extracting labor and tribute for profit through colonial administration in collaboration with local leaders. So the native population is essential to franchise colonialism. Whereas in settler colonialism, Patrick Wolf, and I have his article up in the top right here, describes it as a structure, not an event, because colonialism begins and then it ends with decolonization, whereas settler colonialism doesn't end. It creates new, supposedly homogenous nation states on the lands of other peoples. And the history of the United States is typical in this regard, to try to create something along the model of a European nation state on somebody else's land. So a structure, not an event, because decolonization can't really happen or has to have a very different meaning. It's not expelling the colonizer. It has to mean something different under settler colonialism. Europeans, and I'm quoting Patrick Wolf here in this very well-known essay that kind of defined it and put settler colonialism on the academic map, although the concept had been around well before in Wolf's earlier writings and in even other earlier writings. Europeans used the, quote, logic of elimination to exterminate, displace, and replace the local population to create white people's countries. So ethno-nationalism is imposed through immigration in settler colonial states in a somewhat different process from the way ethno-nationalism is created in the European nation states. But immigration is a really crucial part of the settler colonial project. Immigration of white people, that is. And that's part of the ethno-nationalist origins and continuity of settler colonialism, despite later ideas about multiculturalism in these settler colonial countries. And then I also just wanted to mention one other pattern in terms of post-colonial states that's important for what I'm trying to argue about here, which is that decolonization in, say, Africa, and here I'm looking especially at Adam Getachu's book, but also many other studies, but this is a recent one that I think is really important. Forces they're new multi-ethnic nations, but they exist in a system of global apartheid. So that decolonization doesn't end the political, cultural, economic, social structures of colonialism because they still live in the world that was made by colonialism. So Adam Getachew looks particularly at anti-colonial leaders in the Black Atlantic who tried to imagine something different from a nation state, tried to imagine federations, tried to imagine a new international economic order, who look at the global system and think that decolonization has to also overturn the global system. It's not just creating new nation states, that's not enough. What Adam Getachew looks less at, but I think is also a really important part of understanding decolonization and its travails, is the multi-ethnic nature of the new nation states that have no other model than the European nation state as to what a nation state can be internally. And here I'm turning to two works of fiction because this is what these are two novels that really shaped my thinking on this. And I'm not an expert on African history, but these are both on Africa, seeing the extent to which the project of creating ethnic homogeneity deciding what the ethnicity of the new nation state is a really violent process in post-colonial states as well. And everybody has to read these two books. I'm not going to say that much about them. They are both fiction, but they really show this process from the perspective of some of the minoritized ethnic groups in these attempts to form new nation states. The creation of indigenous peoples is also really a historical phenomenon connected to the formation of nation states. Again, I have so much to talk about here, so I'm going to go through some of this kind of quickly, but hopefully we can come back to it in some of the Q&A. I really feel like James Scott's work on Southeast Asia, the concept of zomia, of peoples who resisted nation state formation and became ethnicized through their escape from state formation. And this is even before the era of nation states, but that in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the hill peoples, and he calls this region of statelessness zomia, of people who are today seen as ethnically different, but if you look back historically, are the peoples who refused to be assimilated into these state and empire formation projects in Southeast Asia. indigenous peoples, and this is again the historicization of indigeneity and its connection to state formation. Indigenous peoples, according to the International Workgroup on Indigenous Affairs, are the disadvantaged descendants of those peoples that inhabited a territory prior to the formation of a state. So that every process of state formation is kind of colonial and includes some people and excludes other people, but that we need to understand the concept of indigeneity as a byproduct of the process of state formation and of colonialism, especially in the Americas, where the people who found the nation states are the descendants of colonizers or are the colonizers themselves. So looking at Ken Coates's Global History of Indigenous Peoples lack political power and autonomy and exist under the control of an immigrant or ethnic group dominated state. So he's looking at both settler colonial roots of indigeneity, of the creation of indigeneity under settler colonialism, or more like what James Scott is looking at, an ethnic group dominated state, those where whoever creates the state, those who are excluded, who are there at the time the state is formed, but are not the ones who were forming the state. So this connection of ethnicization in the creation of indigeneity, which is, I think, a little bit different from the way we tend to understand indigeneity, that I think we need to connect it a lot more to the process of state formation. And in the Americas, of course, there are people in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans, but they're not indigenous people until they are colonized and a collective identity of being those excluded through colonialism and through the formation of nation states creates this larger category of indigeneity. Looking at the Americas, of course, we're talking about colonialism and indigenous peoples. And the US pattern is more classically a settler colonial pattern where the colonizers are the ones who form the nation state. So that independence in the United States is a settler colonial project of independence. It's not the people who are colonized who fight for independence and kick out the colonizers. It's the colonizers who break with Britain and expand the colonial project. So settler colonialism in the United States is a continuity between pre-1775 and post-1776. There's a continuity in the settler colonial project. And in fact, the geographical scope of the settler colonial project, most of it takes place after 1776. Because if you look at what the new country consisted of in 1776, it's a tiny sliver. And the conquest and imposition of settler colonialism and the expansion of European immigration to create this white people's country on someone else's land. Settler colonialism is used much less to understand Latin America, but I am really compelled by those who work on saying, well, we need to understand how both interrelate in Latin America. That is, both under Spanish colonial rule and after independence, using the concept of settler colonialism can help us better understand what's happening, but especially after independence, because like in the United States, most of the governments, even though Latin American independence had somewhat different ideologies from the United States, the governments start to implement very similar types of policies of state-sponsored immigration for racial whitening, of territorial expansion into indigenous lands. And this is really an ongoing process that is still going on today in Latin America. And some of the struggles that are happening today, and I'm just referring here to Giovanni Fazz's work on Guatemala, the fourth invasion, seeing these sort of multiple phases of settler colonialism that are now going on in the highlands of Guatemala through extractive multinational projects, state-sponsored extractive multinational projects that are still dispossessing indigenous peoples of their land. And these myths of indigenous disappearance and, empty lands, and all of these, I think, are really formidable in Latin America as well. I'm going to skip the environmentalist part because I don't want to take too much time. Maybe we can come back to it. So this idea of using settler colonial theory to look at Latin America, I think, is really compelling and is, but just making its way into the academic discourse. And there's two special issues of the American Quarterly and Settler Colonial Studies, one in 2017 and the other in 2021, that have sort of tried to bring together some of the disparate scholars who were playing with this. And both of these, both in 2017 and in 2021, say, this is really a kind of a new intervention in the field, and has not made its way into the mainstream of the discipline yet. But they're both really interesting issues, so I recommend them. And my own work in Columbia, just to talk about for a couple of minutes, if you're familiar with Margaret Jacobson's work on settler colonialism, she does a lot of really interesting comparative stuff, especially about assimilationist projects and the taking of children, whether through residential boarding schools or through adoption and fostering. And she started out looking at the US and Canada, and then added Australia, and then moved into Southeast Asia, looking at these different ways that because the removal of children is one key characteristic of settler colonialism. Like, it's the way of eliminating a culture is by taking the children away and educating them into assimilation. And I was really shocked in looking at so the region that I work in Colombia is a region that's considered really remote, and where conquest really did not take place under the Spanish, and it did not take place during the first century or century and a half or 2 centuries of Colombian national rule either. But Colombia missionized its what it considered its indigenous territories in 1902, created this project of sending out Catholic missionaries into the unconquered regions. And the boarding schools that were founded in La Guajira, the region that I work in, the images are just so hauntingly similar to some of the images that we see from this very same period in the United States, of this attempt to civilize and eliminate indigeneity. And these two of the very young children, with the Colombian photograph on the left and the US photograph on the right, from neither of them is dated, but both of them are late 19th, early 20th century, just because of what they show. And didn't Biden just apologize for the residential boarding schools like today?
This morning.
How many years later? I feel like the concept of settler colonialism, if not necessarily the language, is actually much more widespread in popular movements, and especially indigenous movements in Latin America, than it is in the scholarly literature. And that's also a really interesting conversation. But this is the International Mayan League. Just a friendly, and this is for Guatemalan Independence Day this year, just a friendly reminder that Guatemala is a settler colonial state, continues to violate our right to exist. There is absolutely nothing to celebrate. Let's not ever forget that Guatemala, along with the rest of the modern nation states in this hemisphere, were founded on stolen lands and the genocide and enslavement of our ancestors. And this is like settler colonial analysis here. We are not Guatemalans, nor Mexicans, Belizeans, Hondurans, or Salvadorians. We are not Latinx or Hispanic either. We are Maya from distinct and diverse nations, and our histories predate the creation of nation states and European invasions. So I think this is a kind of language that among indigenous movements in Latin America is very widespread and accepted, but only barely making it into the scholarly literature. And I think Danielle is listening to this, so hi, on Zoom, the author of this post. So the second part of my talk is, where does Zionism and Israel-Palestine fit? So for Adam Kirsch, everything is about how how the concept of settler colonialism shouldn't be used at all. And the way it's used about Israel shows why it should never be used at all. And I think Latin America shows why it should be used, because we can't understand anything without it. But if you just kind of trace the debates that have gone on, Zionism as colonialism, that is, as Europeans, a European project imposed on people, non-European people, a product of British colonialism and European colonialism more generally in the Middle East, especially after World War I. But the counter argument is that, well, Zionism can't be colonialism because the Jews who migrated were not representing a state. Now, even that is kind of fuzzy because, in fact, the project was sponsored by the British, who were the colonial rulers of Palestine at the time. However, the Zionist movement predated British colonialism, direct British rule under the League of Nations mandate, and of course continued after the end of British colonial rule with the foundation of the State of Israel. But the argument is, well, they didn't represent a government. And if you look up in the dictionary, colonialism has to be done by a government. But obviously, settler colonialism, if you understand that concept of colonialism, most of the Europeans are not going in representation of a government. In fact, many of them come, whether it's in Australia or in the United States, many come from excluded minorities, minoritized peoples, impoverished peoples, excluded peoples from the European countries that they come from, whether they're prisoners or indentured laborers or impoverished people who have been dispossessed by the countries or governments that they live under in Europe. So the fact that the Jews who went to Israel, if you're thinking in terms of settler colonialism, there's no contradiction between saying these people were oppressed and they were colonizers at the same time. Is Zionism racism? Is ethno-nationalism racism? Is all nationalism racism? The history that I've just sort of given of nationalism is that, yeah, basically it is. That is the very concept of nationalism. It's very difficult to separate from ethno-nationalism, even and the invention of new ethnicities and new justifications for the existence of a nation state. The very concept of a nation implies some kind of unity among the people. Otherwise, it would just be a state without having to have a nation. And I really recommend Jacqueline Stevens's book too, States Without Nations. So in some respects, the question doesn't even make sense because nationalism is inherently ethno-nationalist and racist if you look at the histories of nationalism. But certainly the Zionist project, as every settler colonial project of bringing Europeans somewhere else to found a country of their own on someone else's land, is an ethno-nationalist project. There's no way to separate it from that. Can Israel be both Jewish and democratic? Well, somehow for Kirsch it can, but it's just really hard if you look from the perspective of like any historical understanding of nationalism or settler colonialism to make the argument that a country can be both ethno-nationalist and democratic. And then he comes down to the question, does Israel have a right to exist? And that most of the people who would argue that Israel does not have a right to exist believe that no country has a right to exist, that rights belong to people, not to countries, and that countries change over time. And I think that that is a really important key issue that Kirsch leaves out, that even the United States has moved away from the ethno-nationalism of its founding, because the United States was founded as a white country, right? Only white people had rights of citizenship, had rights of belonging, were covered by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It was a country founded on the exclusion of non-white people. And yet, the United States has changed over time. The founding fathers would not recognize the country that exists today. And it's not to idealize where we are today, because I don't want to do that, but to say that where we are today is different from what the founding fathers had in mind. and that no country has an essence that if the country changes, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore. So I want to talk, just quickly returning to Israel, Palestine, and to answer the question of why it cannot be both Jewish and democratic, against what Kirsch was arguing. The multiple different statuses that Palestinians have inside 1948 Israel, in the territories occupied in 1967, different in Jerusalem, in the West Bank and Gaza, and in the diaspora, that at every level, and you can look at any human rights organization or United Nations report, that these legislated differences in status for every group of Palestinians, that's what makes it a Jewish state, is the privileging of rights of Jews over rights of non-Jews. But going back to the topic of can nation states change? And what does it mean? What does decolonization mean? What is the solution to colonialism? And obviously, I do not agree with Kirsch's statement that everyone who does not believe in Jewish supremacy believes in the genocide of Jews. That we live in a very unjust world, both in terms of colonial and settler colonial patterns. And by that, I mean both in terms of the global system, which some call a system of global apartheid, due to immigration restrictions and so-called free trade agreements and all kinds of international structures that maintain unequal rights for different peoples of the world, which are based on the colonial patterns, and settler colonial patterns, which I would say is the ethno-nationalism of the explicitly settler colonial countries, but really of every country that exists, because every country is ethno-nationalist in different ways. There's many different levels, but that it is at the heart of the concept of the nation state. Do countries, here's where I mentioned Jacqueline Stevens, States Without Nations, that people have the right to exist. All people have the right to exist, and people have more than the right to exist. People have the right to have rights. But countries, especially in the injustices that they are founded on and that still infuse them, those injustices do not have the right to exist. So the idea is not really to even ask the question of whether countries have the right to exist, but whether countries have the right to be unjust, is how I would rephrase the question, and say, no, countries do not have the right to violate people's rights. Countries do not have the right to be unjust. And so what is the solution? Post-colonial patterns, and this is where Adam Kirsch's book that I referred to before, talking about world making after empire, how independence and nationalist leaders in the Black Atlantic conceptualized how the global system has to change to create justice, the sort of utopian dreams of a more just global order. And then for settler colonial patterns, I really like Olufemi Taiwo's book, Reconsidering Reparations, where he tries to argue that the goal of reparations is not just to document and try to pay back for past injustices, but the goal of reparations is try to repair the injustices as they exist today. So that debating over somebody's ancestry and how much they might have suffered at this one point and how much those particular ancestors might have been responsible for or not in the past is not really the goal of reparations. So the goal of reparations should be creating justice in today's world. And I think that he doesn't think about it in terms of settler colonialism specifically, but in terms of what does decolonization mean in terms of settler colonial entities like Israel, like the United States. I think that thinking about reparations as world making, as creating the world that we want to live in, a world that's based on justice rather than on supremacy and ethno-nationalism, is the goal of reparations, of creating justice. And that any project for reparations justice for Palestinians needs to consider the multiple legal statuses of Palestinians and their need for justice inside 1948 Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and in the diaspora. I believe this is my last slide. I hope it is, because I want to be finished. So I also just want to return to Latin America and some of the ways that I feel like Latin America is actually way ahead of the United States in confronting these settler colonial patterns, and that Latin America's experience with neo-colonialism, even though many have said that the focus on neo-colonialism, that is the global continuing substandard status of Latin America, dependency, has prevented Latin Americanists from seeing settler colonialism. I would argue that the opposite can also be the case, and going all the way back to González Casanova in his celebrated 1964 book, who makes that argument. The habit of viewing Mexicans as an ex-colony or a semi-colony of foreign powers, and of seeing Mexicans generally as subjected to foreign colonization, has blocked the development of the view that Mexicans are colonizers and colonized, seeing the settler colonial nature of Mexico. But I actually feel like in many cases, understanding the neo-colonialism has helped Latin Americans also understand how settler colonialism continues to work. And I quote here Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo, what the Zapatistas, indigenous revolutionary movement of Mexico, made evident to the general population was that neoliberal reform, that is neo-colonialism, had turned the entire country into Indians. So that seeing the overlaying and the parallels amongst these different forms of oppression and inequality, I think, has led to many more openings in Latin America for confronting settler colonialism, as well as for confronting neo-colonialism. And I just look at some of the popular movements that have really made their way into governments to a great extent in the 21st century. The concept of buen vivir, or good living, that is a completely different kind of economic model, not based on capitalism and profit and extraction, but based on both harmony with the natural world, the rights of nature, and among humans, that the good life consists of many other things besides profit and consumption. The concept of plurinationalism, which has now been written into the constitutions of multiple regions and countries in Latin America, that is giving up on the idea of the nation state, and that we are a country of different nations, and that that different groups of people, that there are multiple levels of sovereignty, and that sovereignty has to be recognize all of the peoples of our country, not just one people's sovereignty over others. And different forms of radical democracy that have tried to implement these autonomies for different peoples, not just different regions, but different peoples as collectives, participatory budgeting, the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, which is a international law through the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but accepted by many Latin American countries as well, that Indigenous peoples as collectives have the right to determine their sovereign development priorities, and not have development projects imposed on them by national governments or international agencies and international multinational corporations. So I will end there.
I forgot to say at the start that after Avi's talk, there'll be an engagement with our own Gabriela Valdivia, who's professor in the Department of Geography and director of the Institute for the Study of the Americas. And then after that, there should be a bit of time for some Q&A. So I'll turn the floor over to you, Gabby. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. I'll maybe take about 9 to 10 minutes, and because I'm pretty sure you came to see and speak to Aviva, not me. But if you do come and speak with me, my office is right across the hall, so you can always find me here. So my reflections are, I split them into two. One of them, and I've titled them to remind myself that this is the final message, that if you're gonna walk away right now, I can tell you what the message is. And so the first statement that I wanna talk about is where we theorize from matters. And I mean that in terms of our place, not only in terms of an X, Y coordinate on a map, but more of the, we are here at UNC. And that this location or where can also refer to a social location, as in like where we speak from as subjects. Here we are, students, staff, faculty, managers, affiliated with this higher education institution and its curriculum that is organized around the founding principle of Lux Libertas. So we are here to ask questions, we are here to engage in conversation, and we're here to produce knowledge that is transformative, not only in how we think, but how we behave in this world. And this is funded by and for the people of North Carolina. And where is also our own individual and collective social consciousness. Where we speak from is the effect of power. Social consciousness is recognizing that we may live different realities, but our destinies are tied together by our differences. And so I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geography. I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of the Americas, and I'm also a member of the Latin American diaspora in North Carolina. I grew up in Peru with stories from my parents and my grandparents about scarcity, abundance, joy, loss of the places that they left behind because they wanted to have a better life elsewhere. In Lima, where I grew up, in the middle of a suburb, my father created somehow an orchard in the backyard to stay connected to land and to the land that he had left behind. And he tried to pass on this knowledge to his children, and we all refused it. Sorry to say. My consciousness is shaped by these sorts of legacies, and like other Latin Americans living in the US, I have learned to live between worlds that sometimes are discussing events that happen elsewhere, such as in Palestine, and that we navigate social boundaries and adapt to these cultural differences, and that this is exhausting. There are about 30,000 Palestinians in Peru, where I grew up, and this is part of a vast Palestinian diaspora across Latin America that is estimated to be about 900,000 people. The diaspora is centuries old, but it was exacerbated by the Nakba in 1948, when some 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes by Zionist forces. This diaspora has been growing and is mostly going to Chile, to Honduras, Colombia, and El Salvador. And while assimilation can be a common mode of adaptation when we cross nation-state boundaries, don't expect homogeneous attitudes and perspectives. Some people of the Palestinian diaspora stand in solidarity with Gaza, and some don't. In Honduras, an affluent group of Palestinian families supported the 2009 coup against Zelaya, and in El Salvador, the current president, Nayib Bukele, is of Palestinian descent. As Raul Sibeki recently noted, you might look at mainstream media and think that really there's nothing much going on in Latin America related to movements in solidarity with Palestine or against genocide, or at least that they're not comparable to those in the US and Europe. But in fact, that's not true. Encampments have emerged throughout the region. That is, for example, at the Universidad Central del Ecuador, which Ecuador is where I do most of my scholarship, and at the Universidad de Chile in Santiago. In Mexico, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador defended, quote, the freedom of student encampments at the UNAM campus to protest the Israel army attack on Gaza and in solidarity with Palestine. And I say that with a little bit of irony. You should know that, because as solidarity with encampments is also at the same happening as repression of indigenous peoples in Mexico by the very same government. So it is more of a political statement, I think, in relationship between Mexico and the US than it is about a solidarity stand. But we can talk about that. That's always a conversation. Some Latin American countries are among the most critical of Israel's offensive in Gaza. In 2004, Colombia, Bolivia, and Belize broke diplomatic ties with Israel. Colombia, because of an extensive history of Israeli operatives training paramilitary forces in the 1980s in Colombia, as well as Central America. And Israel has been a key arms and weapons supplier to the colonial military. In the case of Bolivia and Belize, they broke up diplomatic relations, citing the crimes against humanity committed against the Palestinian peoples. Venezuela actually had done that in 2009 already, and in response to the 2008-2009 Israeli military attack on Gaza. Other Latin American countries have recalled their ambassadors to Israel since October 7th of last year, including Chile, Brazil, and Honduras. So these are state actors, right? I'm talking Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, but we cannot ignore the leadership of non-state actors and resistant movements, from the Zapatistas in Mexico to the Mapuche in Chile, who articulate their critiques against imperialism and capitalism with their capacity to imagine and demand that other worlds are possible, and with the struggle in Palestine. What I want to say with this part of where we think from and where we theorize from is that the multiverse of Palestine is alive in Latin America, and we cannot ignore that. So when we're talking about these sorts of struggles, we cannot forget that other parts of the country, other parts of the world are also having their own thoughts, their own ideas, linking them to their own personal struggles. Part two, and this is a message that I like to live by as a member of this university, and it is the collective need to protect the spaces to question, connect, and imagine differently together. So those are the two messages. You can walk away now if you want. I want to thank Abby for bringing our attention to settler colonialism to make room for this important conversation between different areas of the world that share common struggles. As she describes, settler colonialism works in various registers. It has material and spatial dimensions, talked about eradication, elimination, dispossession. It is also processual. It's a dynamic, a dynamic of elimination and occupation are structured by power relations that maintain how difference is used to determine worth. Who is more deserving, who can be encouraged to thrive, and who is allowed to die. It also has a temporal dimension. It's long and ongoing. And in reciting Patrick Wolf, it's not an event, it's a structure. It normalizes and becomes normalized. Settlers are allowed to remain in place, to live, to breathe, to work, to fall in love, to root in place. Their permanence is structured, not natural, same way that nation states are not natural. But the idea that this happens exactly the same everywhere is a big reach, and I think this is the reach that you're talking about with this book on settler colonialism. It's the same thing everywhere. Well, it's not. As Patrick Wolf stressed, to talk about settler colonialism requires being attentive to historical and relational specificity. I think this is the conversation that we're having here today. Settler colonialism is not comprehensive and is not all explaining, and it's not the maximum theory. There isn't one, but there are actually multiple iterations, a sort of series of settler colonial projects that we're seeing are dynamic, ongoing, and adaptive. I also appreciate Avi's intervention in how we normalize master narratives of nation building and nationalisms. As she reminds us, present day colonial relations shape how nation states and nationalisms are structured. These recognitions should be part of our consciousness, don't take them for granted, and awareness of how our destinies continue to be tied together, no matter how different we think we are from each other. As Palestinian writer, intellectual, and activist Edward Said said once in an interview, geography is the only way that I can coherently express my history. I'm a geographer, so I was totally excited about this quote. And it was just one line. Thinking with this, I want to give a shout out to Linda Kikiewicz, and her book is featured right here. She's a graduate from UNC. I want to thank Hannah for pointing me out to this. And it was just published. It's called Palestine 1492. Kiki has been doing a series of podcasts and interviews in the last couple of months. What I really find exciting about this book is that it weaves the historiography of Palestine with that of the Americas, through attention to holy wars and ethnic cleansing and land grabbing and the violent making of nation states and national boundaries. the tying together of projects of homogenization that Avi reminded us about today, the imposition of a one world vision, as well as the intolerance for other worlds to coexist. I want to end by thinking as a Latin Americanist. While I appreciate the way in which settler colonialism is making this entry in the theorizations of Latin America, there are lots of different frameworks that are coming from Latin America that are worth thinking with, alongside with settler colonialism. And I want to ask about what frameworks do we have to think with Palestine from Latin America. And luckily, like I said, there's an abundance. And so I made a list and it was too long. So I'm just sort of going to give you a little bit here. But frameworks of internal colonies and core periphery models of extractive economies, which is like the bread and butter of the stuff that I study. And it is about the connections of uneven development and the links between value capture and the creation of political and economic elites. And if you're interested in stuff like that, Avi mentioned Pablo González Casanova, rooted in Mexico, Rodolfo Rubinstein, and even Charles Wright Mills, right, about those things. They're models of neo-colonialism and development and conservation practices. So we tend to be very critical about the development practices related to neo-colonialism in Latin America. Conservation has it too. You can read the work of Megan Ibarra in Guatemala, where she talks about the eradication of people to empty spaces, so then protect those as conservation sites and conservation parks. We have really interesting cases in the Amazon where you have the rightful return of native lands to people in the Ecuadorian Amazon, for example, but that this very rightful return implies the displacement of other indigenous people. There is a litany written about raza cósmica and mestizaje, and you mentioned, you had that in your article, I remember that you sent, where there's like the sort of, the role that public education had. Public education was weaponized at the beginning of the 20th century to create monolingual, homogeneous national cultures that erased, assimilated, and occupied and re-educated young people with supremacy and patriarchy as fundamental values of a better state. You can read the work of Jose Vasconcelos, wrote and proposed this idea of la raza cósmica, sort of this mixing together of peoples, so we could get the best of those peoples and forget other characteristics that might be detrimental, might not be useful for a good state. In Mexico, obviously, this took place through the nurturing of the elimination of indigenous languages for nurturing the modern citizen. In Peru, a very recent example in the 2000s, where you have the eradication of entire generations of people through forced sterilization under the government of Fujimori, with the rationale that, quote, rural peoples could be too easily duped into taking arms against the state. Yeah, we have legacies of insurgency and counterinsurgency, lessons about how the School of the Americas also led to incredibly devastating and damaging change in Central America, but actually it is all the Americas really that were involved with the School of the Americas. And we also have, and I don't want to just sort of end up in this sort of like structures that we cannot act against the structures are all over us, we can't do anything. I want to end up with a celebration of the praxis of resistance and refusal of several movements in Latin America. Movements that aim for sovereignty and self-determination and that are fighting for a different world for all of us to exist together, a place of freedom with dignity. Sort of reinterpreting the Zapatistas and what they say, without a transformation of consciousness and awareness of our interconnected fates, we will repeat that which dominates us. When I end up my reflection on this note of consciousness and the two take-home messages, where we theorize from matters, and what Said said, which is geography is the only way to tell my history. None of us is outside or beyond geography, and none of us is free from the struggle over geography. To know oneself is to ask where we theorize from. Thank you for the opportunity to question, to connect, and to imagine together.